Know, scrutinize, fathom yourself, not in terms of your natural perfection, your fitness or unfitness for all sorts of optional or even commanded ends, but rather in terms of your moral perfection in relation to your duty. That is, know your heart, whether it is good or evil, whether the source of your actions is pure or impure, and what can be imputed to you as belonging originally to the substance of man, or as derived, acquired, or developed, and belonging to your moral condition. Moral self-knowledge, which seeks to penetrate into the depth, the abyss of one's heart, that are quite difficult to fathom, is the beginning of all human wisdom. For in the case of man, the ultimate wisdom, which consists in the harmony of a being's will with its final end, requires him first to remove the obstacle within, an evil will actually present in him, and then to develop the original predisposition to a good will within him, which can never be lost. Only the descent into the hell of self-knowledge can pave the way to godliness. Immanuel Kant. For several weeks and months now, I have been giving lectures on Kant's moral philosophy, and I have discussed basically everything there is to his ethics. What is their foundation? What is the moral law? What is our specific moral duty? How does Kant categorize the duties into duties towards others and towards oneself, into narrow and wider duties? But there's one thing left, because all of that is kind of pointless if you don't have a conscience. Because without one, you just don't care about being moral, right? Or maybe you can even pretend to yourself that you are being moral, that you are following the moral law, but you're not really checking yourself critically. You're not really asking in a specific given situation, have I really done what I ought to have done? So all of morality hinges on you being conscientious. And that is why I want to discuss this here. Kant himself says that this is basically the most important duty towards oneself. And since, as I discussed in the lecture about that, those are the most important duties, it is basically the most important duty of all. To follow that ancient Greek maxim of know thyself. However, to Kant, this is mainly a practical maxim. It's not so much about know who you are as an individual, know your own psyche, but rather it is about know your own morality. Know whether you are a good person or not. Critically examine your deeds. And this sort of self-criticism and self-examination is something we should always do, Kant says. However, it must be done in the right way. There is a way to sort of overdo it, because there's this self-criticism that with Nietzsche we could call slave morality, where you are just constantly beating yourself up and feeling bad about what a big sinner you are, right? This is the self-criticism, Kant would probably say, of monks. The monk who actually doesn't do good deeds, who isn't of use to anyone because he's stuck in his monastery cell all day. But he's constantly on his knees lamenting what a sinner he is, whipping himself, putting ash on his own head, and constantly seeking within the depths of his psyche, of his consciousness, or even of his unconscious hidden vices, hidden bad desires, that he can, yeah, scrutinize himself over. And maybe this is not done within a Christian framework anymore so much. But nowadays there are secular versions of this, right? Like certain leftists with, let's say, their critical whiteness will tell you and who will tell themselves that we are all racist, we all have internalized racism, which, no, I mean, speak for yourself, but I'm not racist. To me, all people are equal. Um, and who will always go on about how they still also hold some unconscious racist prejudices that they have to work on and feel bad about. Um, this is not what we should do, Kant would say. So you should examine yourself, you should criticize yourself, but it should not be an end in itself, and it should not feed your own self righteousness, beating yourself up to, in a sneaky way, elevate yourself, but rather it should be a means to an end. It should always serve the purpose of actually improving, cultivating your morality, and to Kant that always means your moral actions. That is also why Kant often expresses his skepticism towards people keeping a diary. And his example how that can take a wrong turn is often Lavater, the Swiss Calvinist priest who was somewhat famous in the day. If you are too occupied with yourself, you can become self-obsessed and turn away from the world, so to say. And this can easily turn into what Kant calls Schwärmerei, into raving. And particularly, Kant says you should not be too preoccupied with your own feelings and sensibilities. Because there is the danger of confusing your inner sensibilities, which are entirely subjective, for actual objective insights, which is also something that a lot of people nowadays do, right? Both on the left and the right. I mean, the right accuses the left of that, but the right also does it just as much. Just going off feelings, or rather sensitivities, and believing those to tell something about the actual objective world. And it would be easy, when it comes to morality, to confuse your inner feelings of compassion and empathy, your inner good wishes for world peace or whatever, to confuse that for true good character, and to think you actually already are good or already are working on becoming a good person just because you have these inner feelings. But Kant would say actual morality is about doing good deeds. So if you keep a diary, Kant says, it's better not to focus too much on how you feel, because that is subjective and fleeting, but rather to take note of your deeds. What did you do in a specific day? And then check if you did what you should have done, or if you have to improve the way you are acting. And for that, for this sort of self-criticism, we need a conscience. Now, what is the conscience? You might think that it is the faculty by which we judge our actions and ourselves, or judge whether we have been moral or not. But Kant would say no, that is not the case. judging whether an action is moral or not is, like all judgments, the job of the thinking faculty, made up of the intellect, the power of judgment, and reason. It is the thinking faculty that judges. The conscience itself does not judge the morality of an action, but it checks if you have judged it, and if you have judged it properly, if you have been certain, or if you have done that action despite being certain of its morality. That is also, and this is very important to Kant, that is also why the conscience can never go wrong. Most people would think that it can, right? Most people would say, oh, but you can do evil things while having a good conscience, thinking they are good. And you can do good things while having a bad conscience, feeling bad because you think it's bad. But Kant would say no. The conscience as such can never misjudge, but not because it judges correctly. Rather, as with sensuality, which I discussed much earlier in my lectures on Kant's methods, on Kant's critical method, as with sensuality, Kant says the reason it cannot misjudge is because it doesn't judge at all. And this is important. It must be that way. Not just it should, it must. If our conscience could ever be wrong, then all of morality would be pointless. There could be no morality if the conscience could go wrong. Because if you can do an evil deed without a bad conscience, then you would not be responsible for it. I mean, it would not be your fault, because how could you have known that it is a bad deed that you shouldn't have done if your conscience didn't tell you? No, Kant says the conscience cannot go wrong. What can go wrong is our thinking faculty, which is judging. Of course, when we judge, is this a good action or is this a bad action? Should this be done or should it not be done? Here we can go wrong. But if we ask ourselves, and that is the conscience job, if we ask ourselves, have we judged? And have we judged conscientiously? Here we cannot go wrong as long as we are honest with ourselves. I mean, we must know whether we have checked the morality of an action or not. So that is what conscience does. And to Kant, that is not a faculty, because a faculty, like the intellect, like the power of judgment, to him is something which we control somewhat. We can choose ourselves when and how to use it. While the conscience is more like an instinct. It just overcomes us, right? When you have a bad conscience, you cannot just turn it off. So to him, the conscience is basically the moral law within us itself, or rather it is our instinct to check our own actions against the moral law. Now, an important question, of course, is when the conscience judges us, so to say, and again, the action as such is judged by the thinking faculty, who is actually doing the judging? Because if you think about it, to say, I judge myself, sounds a bit paradoxical, right? How can I be both the judge and the convict, he who is being judged? Well, here it is important to remember that Kant distinguishes between the homo phenomenon and the homo noumenon. I have further explained this distinction in my lecture on the apperception, on the self-consciousness. And I've come back to it in many of the lectures on Kant's moral philosophy, because to Kant, there is the homo phenomenon, the appearing human being, that is the specific individual, you or me, that appears in the sensual world, outwardly with a body, inwardly with a psyche. And then on the other hand, there is the homo noumenon, the rational human being. So the human being in itself, our humanity, that which actually makes us human, that is rationality, autonomy. And these two must be kept apart. Now, there are instances, Kant would say, where a sensual man judges himself, the sensual man. But this judgment then is not a moral one. It is a judgment that is about prudence. So sometimes we may reproach ourselves not for having acted against the commandments of morality, but for having acted against the advice of prudence, right? Everyone knows of such situations where you beat yourself up because you have done something, not because it's immoral what you did, but because you harmed yourself, you messed things up for yourself, you didn't achieve your own happiness because you made a mistake, right? Telling yourself, oh, if only I had done better in that job interview, I would have gotten the job, or oh, if only I had learned for the exam, I would have gotten a better grade, or oh, if only I hadn't messed up that date, and I could have seen that girl again. This has nothing to do with morality. This has just to do with not having acted prudently, maybe. So Kant does say that often this is confused. Often this does feel kind of similar to having a bad conscience, and there are instances where we actually have acted in an immoral manner, and we actually do beat ourselves up over that, and we may think that this feeling is a bad conscience, but in fact, Kant says in many instances we probably don't really care about having done something evil. We just care about having done something which harms our own interests. Like maybe you were too rude to someone and now you feel bad about it. And you may think that you genuinely feel bad because you were rude, but in truth, you don't have regard for that other person and you don't care so much about having disregarded him. You care more about the fact that now you lost your connection or lost your reputation or whatever. But when it comes to actual morality, when it comes to actual conscience, Kant says it is the homo phenomenon who is being judged, but it is not he who judges himself, it is the homo noumenon who judges the homo phenomenon. So, rational man in me, my own rationality, judges the sensual man in me, judges me as a sensual being, which, however, is capable of being rational. Right? If I, as a homo phenomenon, wasn't capable of being rational, then I could not be judged. I would not be responsible for my actions, just like an animal. An animal is just sensual, with no rationality, and precisely for that reason, like if a shark bites off someone's leg, we don't say the shark is responsible, the shark committed an evil action, because it is not capable of rationality and of understanding that this action would be bad. But since I am, then the rationality in me can actually judge me. And what this means is that I have in me this ideal of the perfect human being. this ideal of how a human being, a fully rational human being, should be, which I discussed further in the lecture on the ideal of holiness. And I hold myself against that ideal, and now I judge how close I come to that ideal and how I fall short of it. Kant also says in his philosophy of religion that conscience is the deputy of God here on earth. So the voice of our conscience is basically the voice of God to Kant. More specifically, in Christic terms, it is the Holy Spirit. Right? In the Bible, Jesus, after the resurrection, when he tells his disciples that now he will leave them for good, he also tells them that they don't have to be afraid to be without him and without his guidance. They don't need his guidance because he will send them someone else to guide them, a consoler. And this is interpreted in different ways, but the most common, the most standard interpretation is that this is the Holy Spirit, which a few weeks later at Pentecost comes over the disciples. So now they don't need Jesus, they don't need the Son of God walking beside them, telling them what to do and what not to do, but rather now they have God's Spirit inside them to tell them what to do. And this Kant interprets as the conscience, which is in fact not in contradiction with what I said before. That is that in his moral philosophy, so when you exclude religion, the conscience is the homo noumenon inside us, or the ideal of the perfectly holy human being inside us, or the moral law inside us, because to Kant that is really one and the same thing. And I discussed that in the lecture on the ideal of holiness. The ideal of holiness is the concept of the fully holy, the fully perfect human being. And that perfect human being would, of course, be the very image of God, because he would be holy just like God, and they would want the same thing. This human being would not want his own things, would not have his own base desires, but rather his will and God's will would be identical. So you could say that this perfect human being would be the Son of God, would be Christ. Whether you believe that the historical Jesus actually was such a holy being and therefore was the Son of God, that is secondary to Kant. But you have this idea of Christ, of the Son of God, of the human being in God's image. You have that in yourself. And that is precisely what you should measure yourself by. And that is why the rigorism of Kant is so important. I discussed that also in its own lecture. The lecture is Kant's morality too strict and unrealistic. Kant is often accused of his moral law being too strict, too rigorous. But as I explained in that lecture, that is necessary. Kant is not pedantic, and Kant is not unjust, and it's not that Kant condemns people for every small misstep. But he says, while we can forgive the specific individuals for their imperfection, we mustn't make the law itself imperfect. Like saying from the beginning, oh, people are so imperfect, they can't follow a perfect law anyways, so let's give them a law that is more easy to follow. No, the law itself, the moral law, must be imagined as perfectly holy and as demanding nothing less but holiness. Because only then can we, as a homo phenomenon, as this specific human being appearing in the sensual world, only then can we judge ourselves properly according to that law which demands perfection. If the law itself is lowered to the level of our imperfection, our sensuality, we would basically judge ourselves by the standard of ourselves. We would say we are already good enough by basically just being how we are. And this, of course, has nothing to do with how a rule of law state functions, right? You cannot preside over yourself as a judge. The judge and he who is judged must be two separate people. Now, what is interesting is what Kant has to say about conscientiousness. To him, it does not mean that you do something without knowing that it is evil. Of course, if you do something knowing that it is evil, you are not conscientious. But even if you do something without knowing it is evil, that is not enough. Rather, being conscientious means only doing something knowing that it is good. Conscientiousness to him is the mode of thinking where you always act with moral certainty, as he says. So, for example, when it comes to lying, Kant does not consider it a lie only to say something which you know is untrue. Of course, that is a lie. If you know you are saying something not true, you are a conscious liar. But you can also be an unconscious liar if you say something which you don't know to be untrue, which maybe you even believe to be true, but you don't know that it is true and you still pretend that it is true. I mean, it would be one thing to state, I believe this is true, in my opinion this is probably true. That would not make you a liar. But if you present an opinion as if it was knowledge, as if it was a fact, that is, if you aren't open about your subjective uncertainty, that would already be enough to make you a liar. Maybe examples can make more clear what Kant means. He himself gives the example of someone who judges heretics who should be burnt. Now, such a judge, such an inquisitor, let's imagine one who maybe doesn't even believe in the dogma of his own church. Maybe he's a cynic, maybe inwardly he's an atheist, he doesn't believe, but he doesn't care about burning people which he himself thinks are basically innocent. Or maybe he's a judge who burns people because he gets something out of it. Maybe he burns someone who he knows has not spoken against the dogmas of the church, who he knows is not an unbeliever, but he burns him because he doesn't like this particular person. And he's glad to be rid of him. Or maybe he burns him because the person he burns is wealthy and he gets to keep the wealth of the people he burns. Or maybe he's just lazy at his job and he doesn't care much about whether the people he burns are guilty or not. So when somebody is accused of being a heretic, he just burns him without really checking. Now, such a judge, such an inquisitor, everyone would say is not conscientious. Even the people of his own faith if they knew, would say he is not conscientious. But now let's imagine an inquisitor who is serious about his job, who believes in his church, and if somebody is accused, he doesn't immediately burn him just because of an accusation, but rather he actually checks if that person really spoke against the dogmas of his church. And if that can't be proven, he lets the person go, saying innocent until proven guilty. Now, such a judge, most people would call conscientious. Even the people who don't share his faith, even the people who say it is terrible to burn heretics, to burn people just for believing something else, would probably say that from his premise, based on the faith he has, him believing that his church is right and that everyone who doesn't believe in his church should be burned, he is at least being conscientious about his job. But Kant would say, no, he is not. If he's burning people at all, he is not conscientious. Because while he may have conscientiously checked whether the accused actually did what he is accused of, whether he actually disagrees on some level with the dogma of the church, what he certainly did not check is whether the dogma of the church is actually true. That is just his opinion, but he cannot just go and burn people based on his opinion. I mean, those people also have opinions. Maybe they believe, having another faith, that he should be burned. And he just happens to belong to the stronger group, to the stronger church. Let's use a second example that maybe is even more obvious. Let's say you have a gun and you shoot out of your window onto an open field just for fun. Now, if you knew that people were walking around down there and you would shoot, not caring whether you hit someone or not, clearly you have no conscience. No one would say you are conscientious. But now let's imagine that you are not aware of any people walking down there. So you are not aware of doing something evil. But still, you are not conscientious, Kant would say. It is not enough to not be aware that you might be doing something evil. You must rather be aware that you are not doing something evil. You must be certain. So if you want to shoot out of your window, it's not enough to not know that there are people. You must rather know that there are no people. So you would have to really check that no one is around and that there's no chance that someone might accidentally walk by and be hit by your bullets, and only then could you in good conscience shoot out of the window. So again, it's not enough to not know that you're doing evil. Rather, you must know, you must be absolutely certain that you are not doing evil, that you are doing something good. And that is precisely what you must check always, if you are indeed conscientious. Because otherwise, if you just shoot out of the window because you don't know that there's someone, but you don't care to really check, let's say you indeed don't hit anyone, because indeed there is no one. Still, that does not make you a good person. That does not make you not a murderer, because that is not thanks to your own merit, thanks to you really making sure that you don't hit anyone, but rather this is just thanks to a lucky coincidence that nobody came by. But coincidences don't make you a better person. They also don't make you a worse person. The only thing that makes you a good person is your own goodwill. And if you really have the goodwill to not hit anyone, you are not gonna shoot unless you really are certain that there is no chance of possibly hitting someone. Kant likes quoting the ancient Latin authors, and one of his favorite quotes is quod dubitas ne feceris, which means that which you doubt, so that which you are uncertain about, don't do. He says he's against the moral probabilism, as he calls it. Probabilism would be the belief that it is okay to experiment in moral matters, that it is okay in moral matters to take a risk, but it is not, Kant says. He would say that there are three modes of taking something to be true: opinion, belief, and knowledge. And reason only knows the latter two. Reason only knows belief and knowledge. But within reason, there is no place for opinions. And when it comes to the practical, to our actions, we have to act rationally. That is, we cannot act based on opinions. Kant says in the theoretical realm, it is fine to have opinions. You can have opinions on certain theoretical matters. For example, on whether there are aliens out there on some other planet, which was an opinion that Kant held, for example. But when it comes to our actions, you cannot act based on mere opinion. You must act on true conviction, either belief or knowledge. And it is not enough to not act conscious of the fact that your action is unjust, but rather if you act without being conscious of the fact and being certain of the fact that your action is absolutely just, then you are already evil. And unfortunately, this moral probabilism is very, very widespread. Almost anyone is a moral probabilist. And unfortunately, people don't even have the honesty to just admit that they simply don't care about the morality of their actions. Rather, they still, at least many people, would insist that no, they are good people, they wouldn't do an evil action, when in fact other things just matter more to them. So, for example, a friend of mine has a roommate who's quite an unpleasant fellow, who actually is dishonest enough to claim that he's interested in Kant and that he has great respect for Kant's categorical imperative, but in fact he doesn't care at all about the categorical imperative. So this guy is basically an incel. I don't think he has been with a woman in almost 20 years since he had a divorce, and he is of course mad at his ex-wife. His now adult daughter doesn't speak to him anymore, and as those incels are, he's mad at women in general. And one time he basically out of nowhere, there was not even a reason for that, said that it is illegal in Germany to kiss. And I was there, the friend whose roommate it is was there, other friends of mine were there, and at first we thought this is some bad joke, because obviously it's not illegal to kiss in Germany. But he insisted, no, that he's serious. So we kept asking, why would kissing be illegal? Why do you think it's illegal? And he said, oh yeah, because you cannot kiss a woman without consent. So if you kiss her and then she says that she didn't want it, then you can be sued for sexual harassment. Which, yes, that is true. Also, I think his opinion was that this is a new law that the woke people passed, which of course is not the case. This has been law for quite a while before woke was a thing. Um, but of course, that doesn't make kissing as such illegal. That just makes kissing without consent illegal. I mean, you might as well claim that sex is illegal in Germany just because you're not allowed to rape. Um, and of course, we argued with him that this is a good law, that it should be that way. Um, that you should not be allowed to just grab a random woman on the street and just kiss her. Um, I actually asked him what he would think if somebody did that to his daughter, just forced himself onto her and forced a kiss on her. Um, because usually, right, with these people, um, they will talk like this in general, but at least when it comes to their own family members, they can somewhat see reason. But not this guy. He said, "Oh no, what's the problem? It's nice being kissed. If she complained about that, I would try to talk to her that it's not such a big deal, that it's a compliment." Yeah, well, as I already said, his daughter isn't talking to him anymore. I wonder why. Definitely dad of the year. Um, but the thing is that he ended up saying, "Oh, this is these woke laws. They are killing all romanticism," because he said, when you're having a nice date in candlelight with a woman, then it would be romantic to just lean over and kiss her, and if you have to like take a break and first have to ask her formally if she gives you consent to be kissed, then that is not so romantic. And of course, one thing you can say to this is that this is just silly because nobody is saying that the consent needs to be verbal, right? If you are not completely clueless, then in many situations you can probably tell whether you have someone's consent for kissing or not. Like in that scenario, romantic candlelight dinner, if you lean closer slowly and she doesn't pull away, but maybe also leans in, then maybe that is enough expressed consent. But that aside, let's say you really are unsure whether she wants to be kissed or not, then in that case, yes, you should ask her. You should ask for verbal consent. And maybe he's right, maybe that's not quite as romantic as just leaning in and kissing her passionately. But the thing is that morality is more important than something being romantic. I remind you here, I addressed that in previous lectures already, the lecture on is Kant's moral philosophy too strict, um, that the the principle of morality is the old fiat justitia et pereat mundus. So let there be justice even if the world may perish. So to a moral person, justice, that is what is right, comes first. And it is non negotiable. And everything else, the whole world, with all parts of the world, including your own desires, which are part of the world, uh, for example, the desire for something romantic, everything else comes second. You are allowed to have desires, you are allowed to seek certain pleasures, but only within the boundaries of the moral law, right? While the evil person is not necessarily he who goes around murdering and raping, like actually doing great evil deeds, but rather you are already evil in your heart if you don't follow this principle. If rather your principle is the opposite, saying fiat mundus, or whatever part of the world you want there to be, so let there be the world, et pereat justitia, even if justice perishes over it. And that's the principle, unfortunately, of most people, right? Most people don't outright want to do evil. They don't go out of their way to do evil. But in many situations, they will say, the world, that is that part of the world I care about, that is my desire, comes first, and I will do what is right only if it doesn't get into conflict with the world. As opposed to, I will only engage in the world if it doesn't get into conflict with what's right. So, in this instance, the guy says, sure, I don't want to be a rapist or something, right? Like, he's not a guy who would actually purposefully harass women, but he would do it without purpose. His desires, his sexual desires, his romantic desires come first for him, and what is actually right, the woman's consent, the woman's autonomy, comes second. He does want to respect her to a degree, but not at the cost of a nice romantic moment. While a good person would be, a person who is not a moral probabilist, would be the opposite. He wants a nice romantic moment, maybe, but not at the cost of not respecting or revering the woman's autonomy. And that is what Kant means. If you are conscientious, it's not enough to not do something which you know is bad. Like, this guy, if he knew the woman does not want to be kissed, I don't think he would force himself on her. He wouldn't go that far. Like, if she already stated, I don't want that, okay. But that's not enough. But rather, to be really conscientious means not even taking the risk of doing something that is unjust. So, not just not doing things you know are unjust, but only doing things you know are just. And yes, if that means you have to sacrifice a tiny little bit of romanticism, then so be it. That's really a small cost. Kant would say, even if actually in the sensual world, with an actual deed, you have never yet raped or harassed anyone, you already are a rapist in spirit if you don't care about the risk of raping or harassing somebody by accident. And in order to be conscientious, and in order to make sure whether you are certain about something, Kant proposes an easy test. And that is the test of the bet. Would you be willing to bet on it? And how high would you go? What stakes would you be willing to accept for a bet? So let's take a judge. This time not some inquisitor, not somebody who judges heretics, but let's say he judges an alleged murderer, and he judges him to be guilty, and to be he hands out a capital punishment, so to be executed. Now, let's ask this judge, are you certain that this person, which you just ruled to be executed, that this person is really guilty? The judge will probably say yes. So ask the judge, let's assume the guy is executed, and then later, in a year, in 10 years, in 20 years, new evidence comes out, and we find out that he was accused wrongly, and that he was actually not the guilty murderer. Would you be willing to agree, if that happens, to pay a fine of 10 euros? The judge will probably say yes. So let's ask him, would you be willing to pay a fine of 100 euros? Would you be willing to pay a fine of 1,000 euros? Would you be willing to pay a fine of 1,000,000 euros? Or would you be willing to bet your own life? Would you be willing to agree that if this guy that you just sentenced to death later is proven to not have been guilty, that then we execute you. Now, if the judge is really absolutely 100% certain that the guy is guilty, and that there cannot possibly be any evidence that could ever come out to prove his innocence, then why would he not agree to that bet? He has nothing to lose, right? But if at some point, maybe not betting 100 euro or 1,000 euro, but when it gets to 1,000,000 euro, or when it gets to his own life, he becomes uneasy and would say, no, I don't want to bet that, then that means that he's not 100% certain that his judgment is right. Maybe he's 99% certain, but that is not enough. I mean, especially if you sentence somebody to death. If there's even a 1% probability that he might be innocent, then you are not conscientious condemning him to death. So that is what you should check with yourself. Would I be willing to bet on this? And how much would I be willing to bet, right? How certain am I? So that's why it was such a great scene some years ago when a famous climate change denier and anti-environment lobbyist said that
do not believe that glyphosate in Argentina is causing increases in cancer. You can drink a whole quart of it and it won't hurt you.
You want to drink some? We have some here.
I'd be happy to, actually, but not really. But
not really.
I know it wouldn't hurt me.
If you say so, I have some glyphosate.
No, I'm not stupid.
Ah, okay. So you.
No, but I know
so it's dangerous, right?
No, people try to commit suicide with it and fail fairly regularly.
Tell the truth.
It's not dangerous to humans. No, it's not.
So you're ready to drink one glass of glyphosate?
No, I'm not an idiot.
That shows clearly that before he lied, right? If you really believed with 100% certainty that this stuff is so harmless that you can even drink it, why would you not demonstrate it by drinking it? If you don't want to demonstrate it, that clearly shows that at least some part of you doesn't believe it, that at least you have some doubts. I mean, in this case, probably more than some doubts. He probably knew that he was a liar. But at least if you have only a little doubt, that means you are not conscientious. And Kant also says that the highest possible stake there is in such a bet is to bet on our eternal felicity and blessedness. So the question is, would you be willing to stand in front of God? And this is a question you can ask even to the atheist, because it's about a thought experiment, right? Doesn't matter if there really is a God. But let's say there is. And let's say at the end of your life you stand in front of God to be judged. Would you be willing to say, here in this instance, I did what was right. My action was just. And if I'm wrong, I'm so certain about it that I say, if I'm wrong, then cast me into hell. Everything else I ever did should not matter. Maybe I was always perfect, I always did good deeds, and maybe this one thing is the only time I did something wrong. So maybe you would usually put me into heaven and forgive this one sin of mine. But no, I'm so certain that this one action was right, that it is not a sin, that I want all my other actions to not count. I want it all to depend on this. And also, maybe usually you would be merciful. Because you're so all loving, maybe usually if this was a sin, you would still let me go into heaven. I don't want your mercy. I want your justice, and I want it to depend on only this one action, because I'm so certain that this one action was right. That is what you should ask yourself. Are you willing, would you be willing to say this to God? If yes, then you are conscientious. if you are aware that you would not be willing to bet your eternal felicity on some action that you did being right, but you still did the action, then you are not conscientious. And here you can very clearly see how most people have no conscience at all. Absolutely zero conscience. Because they constantly say things and do things without being willing to bet on them. And usually you don't even have to go as far as to ask, would you bet your eternal felicity on that? But rather, usually they wouldn't even bet much smaller things, much more mundane things. They wouldn't take much smaller risks. I mean, let's look at our politicians. And to say that they have no conscience is, of course, not a very new revelation. I mean, in our politics, this is a condition. You cannot get to the top if you have a conscience. They are all liars. But imagine if we took them by their words. Imagine if a politician was still allowed to say whatever he wants, to make whatever promise he wants, but if he didn't actually deliver, he would not go to hell, he would not be executed, but imagine if just his political career would end. So, for example, remember how Trump said, oh, Biden, he doesn't get anything done, he can't finish the war in Ukraine. If I was president, I could stop the war in 24 hours. Well, by now, a few more than 24 hours have passed. So imagine if Trump had been allowed, freedom of speech and everything, had been allowed to say that, but under the condition that, okay, Mr. Trump, but if you become president and don't end the war within 24 hours, then you stop being president. Then you are impeached. Doesn't matter how many people voted for you, you promised this, so if you don't deliver, you are no longer president. I assume that in that case he would not have made that statement, because of course he knew full well that it was an empty statement. Likewise, here in Germany, our current Chancellor Merz, apart from being a genocide supporter, he is also a notorious liar. He's the leader of the Conservative Party, and 12 years ago, a new Nazi party was formed. And ever since then, they have grown stronger and stronger and stronger. And he blamed the current politics. He also blamed Merkel, who was the leader of the Conservative Party before him, but who was sort of a political enemy of his. And when he took over the Conservative Party and when he became their candidate, he promised that he would halve the votes for the Nazi party. That with him leading the opposition at the time and then becoming chancellor, he would make this party that has been growing and growing for years grow smaller again, and he would halve the results in the polls and in the elections. Well, now they are the strongest party in the polls, stronger than his party. For the first time ever since the actual Nazis, since 1933, a Nazi party is once again the strongest party in Germany. So, once again, imagine he had been allowed to make that claim, but we would have said, okay, but if you don't manage to halve the results, then you are gone. And you are never allowed to enter any political office again. He probably would not have made that statement then. But let's not dwell too much on politicians who, as I said, are of course without conscience by profession. But the regular people, they also have no conscience. And here too, imagine if we had laws that allowed for freedom of speech but with the condition that whatever you do choose to speak, you get measured by, and you have to live with the consequences. And just to be clear, I'm not proposing making this actual law. This would, of course, not be a good thing, and also it just couldn't practically be done. But let's just imagine for a second. Let's go with all the conspiracy theorists. So, for example, the climate change deniers. And I'm not just talking about those people honest enough to outright say there is no climate change. No, I'm talking about all the dishonest climate change deniers too. Like, for example, earlier this year when we had an election in Germany, there were polls what people think is the most important topic, and most people thought it was immigration, which is wrong, of course. I mean, it's not even amongst the 10 most important topics. It's just not important. I mean, even taking the climate aside, we have real problems in Germany. No one can afford rents. There are 8 people dying in traffic every day. Every other day, a woman is killed by her partner or her ex. The pension system's close to breaking down. We have real problems. But yeah, number 1 was immigrants, and then number 2, I think, was economy and stuff. And I think about 90% of people in the polls did not say that the climate crisis is the most important political issue. So that means that 90% of Germans are climate change deniers, whether they like hearing it or not. Because it is simply a fact that this is the most important issue, right? It is simply a fact that in the face of complete climate breakdown, all the other issues won't matter at all. So all these people who might say, yes, there's a climate change, yes, we should do a bit about it, but who will say, oh, it's not gonna be that bad, or you are being too alarmist, all these people are de facto, even if they are not honest enough to admit it, climate change deniers. Now, let's imagine a world where you had the freedom of speech to deny the climate change. But if you say something like, for example, oh, the sea levels are not gonna rise, then you get deported to the Maldives. And you are not allowed to ever leave them again. You can live there freely, but you're not allowed to leave no matter what happens. Now, why would you have such a problem with that? I mean, it's a nice place, it's paradise on earth, right? Would be a nice place to live. Unless, of course, the place will be gone because the sea levels rise in some years. So, if such a law would make you shut up, then by that you admit that you are not truly certain that the sea levels are not gonna rise. But if you aren't, then how irresponsible and how unconscientious it is to risk the whole future of humankind on something which you yourself are not certain about. Or let's take the conspiracy theorists when it comes to COVID. I have read so many comments in past years online about the vaccines of people saying, oh, everyone who got vaccinated will be dead within 5 years. Now let's imagine, once again, we still had freedom of speech. You could still say such nonsense. But there would be a law that if you ever said that, then everyone who has been vaccinated against COVID after 5 years was allowed to murder you without facing any consequences. But only those who can prove that they got vaccinated more than 5 years ago. Now, why would you have a problem with such a law? For example, I would not have a problem with a law that says that any person who is at least 1,000 years old is allowed to murder me. Because I so firmly believe that it is impossible for a human being to grow this old. And I firmly believe that there is no human being on this earth who could possibly prove that he is 1,000 years old, that I would not mind if the law said, okay, anyone above 1,000 years is allowed to murder me. So if they really believe that anyone who got vaccinated dies within 5 years, why would they mind if those people are allowed to, after 5 years, murder them? And those people are not gonna be around anymore to murder them if they are white, right? But if they would mind such a law, then they admit that they don't truly believe what they said there. But if they don't truly believe it, then why do they say it? I mean, of course, it's clear why. Because they are dishonest liars. Because they are people without any honor or responsibility. Because they have no conscience. Or take the conspiracy theorists that say that there is no genocide in Gaza. And let's be real at this point, this is also a conspiracy theory, right? We have somehow deluded ourselves into thinking that conspiracy theories, they are just stuff that right-wingers believe in, that some fringe lunatics believe in. But the simple fact is that liberals, that centrists, that decent society are just as capable to believe in conspiracy theories and just as likely to believe in conspiracy theories as some right-wing nutjobs. And I frankly don't see much of a difference between someone denying climate change and denying the Holocaust in Gaza. Because, I mean, for one, both are things that you can see with your own eyes. I mean, if you lived more than a few decades, you can see the weather changing. And you can also see other damage to the environment. Like, you can see that there are less insects flying around. I still remember when I was a child and we kept the balcony door open in summer nights, how every day some butterflies or bugs would fly inside, and now that doesn't happen anymore. And likewise, if you just look at what is happening in Gaza, and I mean, the IGF soldiers do you the service of putting online their own war crimes. So it's really not hard to find, right? Everyone can see them posing and dancing around in stolen underwear of Palestinian women. Everyone can see them blowing up empty buildings when there's no military reason to blow them up. And also, in both cases, there is a consensus amongst anyone who has any right to judge, amongst all the experts, amongst all the scholars, right? Every serious climate scholar says there's a climate crisis, and likewise every serious genocide scholar, including the Jewish-Israeli genocide scholars, right? Like Omar Bartov, Ras Segal, Amos Goldberg, Daniel Blattmann, Shmuel Lederman, says that there's a genocide in Gaza. I mean, even the International Association of Genocide Scholars came out and said, yes, this is clearly genocide. So, clearly, these people are also conspiracy theorists, and I refuse to consider them or to call them anything else. So, let's say someone still claims, Israel is making sure not to kill civilians, they are creating safe zones, they are warning civilians before they bomb somewhere. And this is, at least here in Germany, this is still the public opinion, you know. If you live elsewhere, you probably have no idea, and you really can't imagine just how disconnected Germany is from the rest of the world. The German people are very provincial people, and they are very self-righteous people. They think they are right about everything, and that all the rest of the world should look up to them and should do things like they do it. And for that reason, they don't bother looking at the rest of the world and checking if maybe the rest of the world does things differently and maybe even better, or maybe the rest of the world looks at things differently and maybe their perspective is more correct. They don't bother. So the average German is completely imprisoned in the German bubble. He has never checked out any international media. So public discourse is still pretty much where it was in October 2023 here. I mean, there have been some slight shifts, but even now, many people would probably say, okay, Israel is going too far now. But they would still say it's basically a legitimate war that just got out of hand, when, of course, it's not a war, right? It's a genocide. Just like Mike Tyson beating up a 3-year-old child would not be a boxing match. It would just be assault and child abuse, right? And still in Germany, you basically can't say genocide or apartheid or settler colonialism without being cancelled. Again, you cannot imagine just how much Germans live in their own parallel reality. So I still constantly read comments of people saying, oh, Israel is taking care to not harm civilians, and also they say there isn't anyone starving in Gaza, there is no famine. Now imagine, once again, if you had the right to say this, as disgusting as it is, but as a consequence you would be deported to Gaza. Now, I don't see the problem from these people's perspectives, right? They are saying living in Gaza is perfectly safe. If there's no famine, if Israel is not starving people, then they would not starve, right? They would have enough food. And if Israel is constantly warning civilians and not targeting any civilians, then they would not be in danger of being bombed or shot, right? They would just have to listen to Israel's warnings and to go to the safe zones, and they would be perfectly safe. I mean, I've read people unironically saying that all the civilians that have died were just too stupid to follow Israel's warnings. That's right. 65,000 people. And I mean, that's the lowest possible estimate, right? We all know this number is not true. We all know the actual death toll is much, much higher. More than twice as much. Maybe more than twice or 4 times as much. But let's just go with this. 65,000 people were just too stupid. Israel told them, leave this place, and they just didn't, because they were too dumb. They just put themselves and their children beneath the bombs. Well, again, what if somebody who said that was deported to Gaza? Clearly this guy is not dumb, so he would listen to Israel, so he would not be in danger, right? And see, through this, you see, it's not even about eternal felicity with these people. It's about very, very worldly things. And they would not even take these risks. If it honestly came to that, if we honestly had such laws that would put consequences on free speech, not forbid it, but put consequences on it, they would probably shut up. But again, most people have no conscience. They judge things. And some of the most important things where it's about life and death of millions, they judge these based on prejudices. They judge these without knowing anything. And I mean, you must know when you don't know anything about something, right? The only way you cannot know is if you never even ask yourself, wait a second, am I even competent to make a judgment here? Do I even have any clue about this matter? And that's the point. They don't have the self-reflection, and they don't have the conscience to ask themselves that. Like all these climate change deniers. And again, I'm talking not just about the honest deniers. I'm talking about those who say, oh, don't be alarmist, it's not so bad. Just ask these people, do you know what a carbon budget is? And how much we have left? Do you know what the albedo effect is? Do you know the Keeling curve? Do you know what tipping points are? And can you name some? Do you know what a feedback loop is? And most people who will talk like they are completely convinced, saying, oh, don't be alarmist, it's not so bad, will not be able to answer even one of those questions. But then if you cannot answer those basic questions, why would you think that you are competent to judge just how bad it is? Same when it comes to the genocide, right? Like, for example, on my German channel, I got this comment. To mention Israel and Nazi Germany more or less in one breath, just like that, when talking about genocide or violations of human dignity, is utter madness and makes your competence of judgment very doubtful. It was posted under my video on the foundations of morality, where I just say that, well, people might agree, according to Kant, on morality when it comes to their own group. But the problem, the reason why of morality is not universal to them, is that they would say it is universal to all human beings, but they simply dehumanize other groups. So people that don't belong to their group are not human to them, and therefore they think that morality does not apply to them. And I just said this is the case with all genocides, right? The German Nazis probably would have said that, yeah, you cannot just kill another German, but they didn't consider the Jews human. And then I said same was true in the genocide in Rwanda, same was true in the genocide in Bosnia, and same is true now in the genocide in Gaza. The Israelis do not consider the Palestinians human. But apparently this triggered that guy. I mean, to what he said, I can just say, if Israel honestly does not want to be compared to the Nazis, then maybe Israeli politicians should stop recycling old Nazi quotes. I mean, you can make a game out of this, a guessing game. Here, this enemy is not made up of soldiers, but in large parts only of beasts. We are fighting human animals and we must act accordingly. One quote by the fugitive war criminal Yoav Gallant, the former Minister of War of Israel. One quote, a Nazi quote. I'm gonna leave open which is which. You can try to guess. It's not so easy. Oh, here. One quote by Netanyahu and another quote from the leaders of the German army in the Second World War to the soldiers. It would mean insulting the animals if you were to call the features of these, to a high percentage Jewish humans, bestial. I don't call them human animals because that would be insulting to animals. Oh, here, a quote by Hitler. What would have become of the German people and Europe had the German Wehrmacht not raised its shield before Europe at the last minute on June 22, 1941? Who believes that ridiculous guarantees or likewise irrelevant paper declarations by Anglo-American statesmen would have saved the world, faced with an attack by a power which, as American correspondents plainly put it today, has for 20 years pursued the goal of attacking Europe, as in the times of the migration of the people and the Mongolian invasions, destroying its culture and, above all, exterminating the European in order to win slaves for work in the Siberian tundra. Aside from Germany, which state would have been capable of confronting this danger if, since 1941, the greater part of Europe has rallied to Germany in the struggle against the threats from the East? Then this was only possible because, in 1933, this Germany received the political, moral, and material prerequisites for waging this struggle which today decides the fate of the world. All other events pale in comparison with the greatness of this gigantic struggle. Should the new Central Asian rush on Europe succeed, then the present world would crack, just as the old one cracked when confronted by the Hun invasion. Mankind's work over thousands of years would again have been in vain. Chaos would take the place of the most thriving continent on earth. Its culture would be replaced by inconceivable barbarity. And now a quote by Isaac Herzog. And just to be clear, for those people who don't know, he's the president of Israel, but he does not belong to the current right-wing government coalition. Rather, he's a social democrat. He was leader of the Social Democrats, so of the center-left opposition for a time. That, of course, does not prevent him from signing rockets before they are used to kill innocent children. That does also not prevent him from saying there are no uninvolved people in Gaza. It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It does also not prevent him from meeting and posing with the rabbi who started the whole agitation against Rabin in the 90s. The prime minister at the time, who initiated the Oslo process and who then was shot. This Herzog says, this war is a war that is not only between Israel and Hamas. It's a war that is intended really, truly, to save Western civilization, to save the values of Western civilization. We are attacked by a jihadist network, an empire of evil emanating from Tehran, with its forks in Lebanon, with Hezbollah, with Hamas in Gaza, with the Houthis in Yemen. This empire is in Iraq, and this empire wants to conquer the entire Middle East. And if it weren't for us, Europe will be next and the United States follow. I remind all about 9/11 and after. Meaning there are extreme fundamentalists that want all of us out. And that's what we are facing. And the world has to understand it. We didn't want this war, God forbid. We went through hell. But we have to defend our people and enable everybody to go back to the region and live in peace. That's what we are doing for the sake of the entire world. So that quote is for all the people who are still naive enough to think it's just Netanyahu, it's just the right-wing government, if just another government came to power, and not all Israelis support this. Yes, they do. They do. I mean, of course, not all, not 100%. There are some, and the fact that there are so few makes them all the more heroic. There are some who actually are against this, but just like in the Nazi time, the vast majority of the society supports what's happening. And here too, I want to ask these deniers of the genocide, I want to ask them these simple questions. I want to ask them, do you know such quotes? Have you ever listened to Israeli politicians say, we are fighting human animals, we will act accordingly? Or have you seen the Israeli soldiers post their own war crimes online? Or do you know, have you ever heard the name Hind Rajab? Or have you ever heard of the Flower Massacre? Have you ever heard of the massacre against the people from World Central Kitchen? Have you ever heard of the massacre of the emergency workers earlier this year, where Israel killed 15 emergency workers and attacked 3 aid trucks and tried to bury not just the corpses but even the trucks? Have you heard about that? Or have you ever, for even 5 minutes, watched Israeli TV? Which, I mean, anyone can do, right? All of this information is here on YouTube even. You don't even have to go elsewhere. You don't have to look much. You can see it here on YouTube. You don't need to speak Hebrew. There are lots of English subtitles. Have you watched Israeli TV? Where they are talking about how children are the enemy. 4-year-old children are the enemy. Babies are the enemy. Pregnant women are the enemy because they are all gonna grow up to become new terrorists and take revenge. Or I want to ask these people who constantly say, oh, but what about the hostages? Why don't you talk about the hostages? I mean, to be clear, taking hostages is a war crime. I'm not defending what Hamas did there. But I do want to ask these people, are you aware that Israel also holds hostages? And often for a much longer time? And not just a few dozen or a few hundred, but over 10,000 hostages. And are you aware what's happening to them? That they are being tortured daily? That people in Israeli prisons are getting raped? And not just raped by people, raped by rifles, raped with a fire extinguisher, raped by a dog. Are you aware of that? Are you aware of one rapist who was even filmed raping a prisoner? When they tried to convict him, are you aware that Israelis protested not for his conviction, but for his release? So for the rights of their prison guards to rape prisoners. Are you aware that he could speak on TV and justify his rape because they were just terrorists and it's okay to rape terrorists? Justify it on TV? Are you aware of that? I want to ask such people. Or are you aware of the AIs Israel uses? Have you ever heard of Lavender? Have you ever heard of Where's Daddy? Have you ever heard of Gospel or of Wolfpack? Do these names mean anything to you? And if they answer no, which they usually will, especially here in Germany, because nothing, absolutely nothing of what I just mentioned has been properly reported in German media. Maybe one or two of the things I mentioned got mentioned in some small article on the site, but certainly not at the prime time in the news, and certainly not as a headline. So most people really don't know about any of this. All they know is the propaganda. Hamas uses human shields. Israel tries to protect civilians. Israel just wants to destroy Hamas and free hostages. That's still all they know. But if they don't know about all these things I just mentioned, then how do they allow themselves to judge? How can you be completely without conscience, knowing full well, or you could know if you ever self-reflected, knowing full well that you never spend even 5 minutes trying to check what the other side says? I mean, this has been going on for 2 years. You could have checked at some point, maybe when so many people, and so many respectable and serious and good people say this is genocide, maybe they are not all anti-Semites. Maybe they have some point. Maybe even if they were wrong, there is at least some things that point to it, that make it look like genocide. Maybe I should look into that. How is that a thought that can never have crossed someone's mind in 2 years? I mean, I understand if in October 2023, or in November 23, or in December 23, somebody did not call it genocide yet. I understand if at first somebody was hesitant. I mean, Rasse Egal, Jewish Israeli genocide scholar, called it genocide even in October 23, so we could have known back then, but I understand people who didn't. I myself didn't call it genocide right from the start. I mean, I was right from the start against Israel's response. I right from the start said they should make a deal with Hamas to get the hostage back instead of bombing Gaza, but I didn't speak outright of genocide. But and I even understand if at first, out of the shock of October the 7th and in light of all the Israeli propaganda we were flooded with about 40 beheaded babies and babies put in an oven and pregnant women having the baby cut out of their belly, women being raped with knives and having their breasts cut off, all these disgusting fake news that we were told. I can understand if at first people were hesitant to criticize Israel's response. But the thing is that sometime within the last year, within 24, you must, there is no excuse if you didn't, you must have understood and clearly spoken out about it also, that this is genocide. I mean, all serious genocide scholars did. I don't know of any genocide scholar who, beyond 24, still said this is not genocide, of anyone that could be taken seriously. So, after that, it's too late. It's simply too late. If in 24 you didn't realize this is genocide, if it took you till this year, or if even by now you don't say it's genocide, if it takes you till next year or till 10 years, it's too late. Now it's too late to come back and change your opinion. And this is one important thing about conscience, which I want to add to what Kant says. I always tell people, don't be wrong in moral matters. Don't ever allow yourself to not be conscientious and therefore to make a wrong judgment. Because afterwards, correcting your judgment is much, much harder. Because at first, right, when a matter is presented to you and you are asked, is this good, is this evil, you can judge freely. But if you have said this is good when it was indeed evil, then later on, if you want to change your mind and say, no, this is actually evil after all, you cannot judge this is evil. You now also have to judge, and therefore I was evil for supporting it. So, and this goes not just for a big thing like genocide, even in smaller matters, right? I tell this to people, like I tell this to friends. Let's say you have a fight with your friend. Let's say you judge somebody for something they did. I say to people, be careful not to be wrong. Because maybe your self-righteousness, your self-image will not allow you afterwards to admit that you were wrong. I mean, if, let's say you cancelled a friend for something, which you should not have cancelled him for. If, let's say, you did wrong to a friend, and not him to you, it's harder to admit that later on. I mean, let's say after 10 years, waking up after 10 years and saying, oh God, what have I done? I ruined a friendship. I did an injustice to that good friend of mine. That's hard. So better don't do the wrong thing from the start. That's much easier. And the same, of course, is true with the support of genocide. I mean, I understand how these people are stuck at this point. If sometime in 24 you didn't come around, then of course you cannot allow yourself to come around now. Of course you have to double down and defend Israel even more vehemently now. Because to admit now that yes, it is genocide, would also mean admitting that you supported genocide for 2 years. That you were on the wrong side of history, that you were evil. And it would also mean admitting that you cannot be trusted with anything, right? I mean, it's funny, this guy I quoted, he says that I have no competence to make judgments. It's not the first time I hear something like this, whether it's directed at me or at somebody else, and I always find it curious how people can be so sure that they are competent to make judgments, that they are rational people, that they are critical thinkers, that they are people who can think for themselves, when they have no single original thought or opinion of their own. I mean, it's always the people who in every single matter follow the herd, follow the zeitgeist, follow the current prejudices and ideologies of the day, follow whatever the elites, their politicians, their media feed them. It's always those people, curiously, who accuse those who think for themselves and who dare to have a single position which is not currently accepted. It's always those people who will say, oh, you are crazy. You are completely incapable of judging. I mean, I would like to ask this guy, this Wiesengrund, And by the way, it would be even more amusing if he actually named himself after Adorno. But of course I can't know, maybe it's a coincidence. I would like to ask him, when have you ever in your life made a single correct judgment without being told what the correct judgment is, right? Like, of course, this guy probably judges that the Holocaust was evil and that is correct, but would he have said that during the Nazi times? I mean, that's a rhetorical question. We know he wouldn't, right? We know every single person who nowadays supports Israel would have participated in the Holocaust. This is without question. These people have now outed themselves. If you ever wondered what you would have done back then, the answer is, of course, you would have done the exact thing you're doing now. So if now you're supporting the genociders, probably you would have done the same thing back then. But that's the thing, right? So many people are against all the injustices in history, right? They are against slavery, against the oppression of women, they are against the Holocaust, they are against the genocide against the Armenians, or the genocide in Namibia, they are against apartheid. They condemn all the injustices in history. But funnily enough, these people never condemn the injustices of their own day. So when a history book tells them, oh yeah, this thing here in the past that was evil, good thing it stopped, then they nod and say, oh yes, that was evil, we would never repeat that. But when there's no history book yet telling them that something that is happening right now is evil, rather when their own politicians and their own media and their own school told them this is the right thing, which of course is what's happening in German, right? They got taught in school that they have to support Israel, the politicians say it, the media say it, then they will think it's the right thing. But, you know, here's the thing, if you had lived in the Nazi time, the schools, the media, the politicians would also have told you this is the right thing. You should be able to judge good and evil for yourself. You should not have to wait till it becomes the current common opinion. You should not wait till your president or your chancellor or whatever tells you, oh yeah, this is evil, be against it. We don't do that anymore. No, you should be able to judge for yourself, but so many people can't. Like, people nowadays will probably say, okay, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were wrong, but they support Israel. And at the time, 20 years ago, they probably supported the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But they probably said, oh yeah, the war in Vietnam, that was wrong. And at the time, they or people like them probably supported it. And this is because, once again, they have no conscience. They don't ever bother to ask, wait, what if I'm wrong? They don't fear the risk of doing something that is wrong. Sure, they don't know that it is wrong. They don't do evil knowingly, but that does not make it better. It's not enough that you don't know that you are on the bad side. You must know that you are on the good side. You must be certain. You must be willing to bet your eternal felicity on it. And I'm very certain they won't do that. I'm very certain if you asked all the genocide deniers, oh, okay, what if all the world agrees in 30 years that it's genocide? What if all the history books say that it's genocide? What if the international court has ruled that it's genocide? Are we allowed to murder you then? Because you supported a genocide? Of course not. Of course they would never agree to such a thing. Because they are not so certain that they would bet their life on it. And the disgusting thing is, of course, that since they have no conscience, they will never wake up. I mean, they will probably go with the herd. So in 20 years, many of them will probably acknowledge, yes, this was genocide. But this will not have any effect on them personally. They will not say, yes, this was genocide and I supported it. I mean, if they had even a little conscience, then at the point when they realized that it was genocide, they would feel terrible. They would be shocked by themselves. They would say, what have I done? And they would question everything. They would say, if I could not even see this, I mean, the most obvious genocide in history, the most well-documented genocide, the first live stream genocide, the most confessed to genocide by the perpetrators. If I, even here, I needed to be told that it's genocide. I needed to wait till my president or whoever told me this is genocide, and I could not judge it for myself. Then how can I trust myself to judge anything at all? If even here I supported such an obvious evil, how can I ever know if I'm the good guy? I mean, if that was me, if I found out that for such a long time I had supported such an evil, for the rest of my life I would shut up. I would delete this channel, for example, because I would say I am not allowed to teach people, especially not about morality or about Aufklärung, about thinking for themselves. If I have been wrong so grossly and so obviously, I should shut up. And I would also not go to any elections anymore. I would never vote anymore, because I would tell myself, how can I ever trust myself that I make the right choice, that the party I vote for is not evil? Since I was so wrong this one time, this is not a responsibility I should have. I should not be allowed to vote anymore. This is what I would tell myself. But these people, they have no conscience. I mean, I presume that a very few, a handful, will actually at some point wake up and feel bad. There will be very few who are at least as aufklärt and as conscientious as my great-grandmother was, who I think sometime in the 80s said to my dad, actually I could have known. But most people never do that. Most people here in Germany, to this day, like the old people, if they are still alive, will say, oh, I didn't know. I couldn't have known. And likewise, most people here will say, okay, this was genocide, but at the time I couldn't have known better. Well, if that's the case, then how could we, the righteous people, have known at the time? Of course you could have known better. It's the first live stream genocide of history. If you don't know because you don't want to know, because you don't bother ever checking. And I really wonder, whether it's this matter or whether it's other matters, I often wonder, what would society look like if, once again, we had free speech, you could say anything you want, but you would have to get it tattooed on your forehead. So, you don't have to bet your eternal felicity. You don't even have to bet your life. You don't have to bet 1 million or even 1,000 euros. All you have to do is you get everything you say tattooed on your forehead for everyone to read. Just imagine that world for a moment. So imagine the people, for example, in America in the 50s who protested in favor of segregation. Who protested against black kids going to school together with white kids. Or who protested against interracial marriage, saying interracial marriage is communism. I mean, nowadays, these people, when we look back at them, when we see their pictures, we despise them. We consider them disgusting, evil people. Of course, not much has changed, because in our days, you still had people, or you still have people, depending on country, who would protest against gay marriage, right? Like, for example, here in Germany, it was passed not even 10 years ago. And of course, the people who protested against that, in 70 years, when people look back at their pictures, they will have the same feelings and the same judgments as we now do when we see the protesters against interracial marriage. That is without question. But let's say those people back then would have been allowed to protest, but they would have to get it tattooed. I am for segregation. I am against interracial marriage. I am against mixed schools. And let's say 1950, let's say someone was 20 or 30 back then when he took part in that protest. He gets it tattooed. And then let's say he's 80. So, right, that would mean in 2000 or in 2010. And now he's still walking around with, back in 1950, I was against interracial marriage. Let's say someone who voted for the Nazis, right? Let's say he was 20 in 1933 when he voted for Hitler, and he would have had to get tattooed, I voted for Hitler. And then let's say later he gets to be 90, 70 years later, so in 2000, 2003. And he walks around with, I voted for Hitler. And that we could do with all the opinions, right? So, for example, here in Germany, we have this prominent politician who is heads deep in Putin's ass. And she even founded her own party. Luckily, they were not successful enough in the last election to enter the parliament. You need at least 5% for that, and they missed the mark. But she even founded her own party, named after herself. Like the party's name is her name, right? She's known in Germany for her egocentrism and narcissism, which is basically the let's kiss Putin's ass party. And she's constantly talking about how we need to make peace with Putin, we need to negotiate, and maybe Ukraine should give him some territories, and then it will be fine, and we can trust him, and he will not start further wars. She has been in a talk show mere days before the full invasion of Ukraine started, saying, oh no, Putin is not gonna invade Ukraine, and everyone who says that is crazy. Most people have forgotten that. But what if she had that tattooed on her head? And now whenever she sits in a talk show now and says, oh, we should negotiate with Putin and we can trust that he will stick to whatever we negotiate, every time she said that, she had on her forehead, I believed that Putin would not invade Ukraine. And the same for all things. The same with the genocide in Gaza. Imagine people were allowed to say whatever they want about whether there is a genocide or not, but they would have to get it tattooed. I believe that many of the people who now say there is no genocide, if they had to tattoo it on their forehead, would maybe think twice about saying that. Which proves how little conscience they have now. Because they say something which they are not certain of. They say something which they would not dare tattooing on their forehead, making sure that it can be read even in 30 years. I, for that matter, would not have a problem tattooing on my forehead there is a genocide in Gaza. And I said it not directly from the start, but I said it early on. I would not have a problem with that because I'd wager that with the passing time, I would not get cancelled more and more for that, but rather I would be applauded more and more for that. Now, of course, it's a lie. I would not want to tattoo that on my forehead, but purely for aesthetical reasons. Like, I would prefer not to tattoo anything on my forehead. But the point is, I would not mind anyone who meets me immediately for the rest of my life being reminded where I stood. And that's my point when it comes to this bet. If you are not willing to bet and you still support this opinion, you still spread it like you were convinced when clearly you aren't, because if you were, then you would be willing to bet, then you have no conscience. And with this, it hopefully makes even more sense why Kant is so vehemently against any sort of consequentialism. So any sort of moral theory that says it is about the consequences of our actions. We should try to pick the action with the best consequences. While Kant says, no, we should pick the action that is good. We should have a good will, and we should do what is right and just and not mind the consequences. I discussed that in its own lecture on why morality is not about the consequences of our actions, but hopefully it's even more clear now, because Kant would say you cannot possibly know the consequences, so you could not bet on that. You could not bet on this action having a good outcome. So you can never conscientiously be a consequentialist, right? I used the famous trolley example in that other lecture, where you have 5 people tied to the rails and a trolley about to run them over, and you can only save them by redirecting the trolley onto another track, but thereby murdering one person who is tied to that track. Now, to the consequentialist, this seems like an easy calculation. They will usually say, well, better 5 people live and 1 person dies, rather than 5 people die and 1 person lives. But Kant would say, you don't know what has the better outcome, right? You don't know if the 5 people you save, maybe one of them is gonna run amok sometime in the future and is gonna kill 20 people. And so by saving these 5 people, 20 people died. So now, in total, if we want to calculate and weigh human lives against each other, which of course is disgusting to begin with, but in total, 15 people died, right? Or actually 16, because you also killed that other person to save the 5. So Kant would say you cannot possibly, in good conscience, redirect the trolley, because you could not possibly bet your eternal felicity on this really leading to the better outcome, this really having better consequences. What you can, however, bet your eternal felicity on is that you shouldn't sacrifice an innocent human life in order to save others, that it is wrong to murder under all conditions. So that's why you should rather stick to that. And the same is true for the infamous example of lying, right? This is precisely, and I discussed that in my previous lecture on why we must never lie, even if it saves a life. This is precisely why Kant is against so-called emergency lies. Why he says, even if a would-be murderer asks you, is my victim home, it would be immoral to lie. And Kant gives the example that you don't know the outcome. You may lie to send the murderer away, thinking you're gonna save the victim, but maybe in the meantime the victim actually walked out the back door without you knowing. And if you had said the truth, the murderer would have come in and searched the house, and that would have given the victim time to escape, while by lying you send the murderer right back onto the street, where maybe he will run into his victim and kill him. You don't know that. So you can't, once again, bet your eternal felicity on this being the choice with the best results. You can, however, bet your eternal felicity on the fact that lying is wrong. So this is what being conscientious means to Kant. And I will just stress that, of course, the condition of it is truthfulness, being sincere with yourself. Again, I discussed that in the previous lecture on why we mustn't lie, even if it saves a life. Where I already said that this truthfulness is the condition of conscientiousness. Because all of what I just said won't work if you are willing to lie to yourself, right? Like this whole trick with the bet. I think it's a great trick actually to see if you are certain of something and how certain you are, because maybe you would be willing to make a small bet of 10 euros, 100 euros, but maybe not a bigger one. But of course it only works if you are honest with yourself, because you could always tell yourself, yes, I'm willing to bet even my eternal felicity on that. And to Kant, this, what he says here about conscientiousness, is basically what connects moral philosophy with the philosophy of religion, because to him that is what religion means, right? The Latin word religio, he translates it into German as conscientiousness. I mean, obviously he doesn't. He translates it into German as Gewissenhaftigkeit, but if we translate that into English, it's conscientiousness. Because to Kant, and I will further discuss that when I get to his philosophy of religion, to Kant, religion is not about what you believe. Religion is not theoretical. So whether you believe that there is a God at all, whether you believe that he is a trinity, he has three persons, or that Jesus was his son, whether you believe that Muhammad was his prophet or that he chose the Jewish people, all of that Kant calls theology. That's your theoretical opinions about the divine, but that's not your religion. And likewise, cult exercises, whether you pray, whether you fast, whether you go on a pilgrimage, whether you don't eat certain foods, all of that, Kant says, is at worst mere superstition and completely pointless and actually leading away from actual religion. At best, it's a means to an end, a vehicle of religion, as he says, something that helps you be more religious, like praying in order to reconnect with God and thereby become more conscientious, or thereby staying conscientious. But the actual religion to Kant is entirely practical. Actual religion to him simply means trying your best to be a good, to be a holy person, and being absolutely conscientious. That means acting in every single instance as if there was a God looking over your shoulder who would judge you for your action. Every small, even the very smallest action, even picking your nose, should be treated as if God was watching you and judging you for this. And as if you had to eventually justify yourself for having done that action in front of God's throne. That, and that alone, is religion to Kant. And of course that also means that most people are not religious, even if they pretend to be. To Kant, they are pagans, they are not truly religious. Like, if you, let's say, if you persecute gay people protesting and with signs saying God hates facts, well, the question is, would you bet your eternal felicity on that? It's probably your opinion that this is right and so on. But if you really stand in front of God after your death, would you really dare to say, God, I am so certain that you do indeed hate facts, that I'm telling you, throw me into hell if I was wrong on that? No, of course not. These people would be begging God. They would say, please, please let me into heaven. I hope that I was right. I hope that this is what I was meant to do, persecute gay people. But if there's a chance that I was wrong, then please forgive me and still let me into heaven. Or people who murdered the infidels. I mean, would they really bet their eternal felicity on this? On the fact that they have the right face and that other person they murdered had the wrong face and therefore deserved to die? I think if they stood in front of God and God told them, well, tough luck, you were in the wrong club. Actually, those other guys that you hunted down, they had it right, they had the right religion. Those people would not say, okay, then throw me into hell. They would say, oh, please, please forgive me, I didn't know any better, I was raised in this phase, my parents raised me like that. Or like all the Mosian fundamentalists in Israel who say this land belongs to us. God gifted us this land. We are his chosen people. All the non-Jews have no souls. They were just created to be slaves for Jews. Would they really dare, in the end, saying to God, if we were wrong on that, if we were not chosen, if the land was not given to us, if you actually meant for us to share it with the Palestinians, then throw us into hell? No, of course not. Once again, they would beg. They would be on their knees, whining and lamenting and saying how sorry they are and begging for forgiveness. And this is to go back to the example I gave earlier of this judge who judges heretics. This is why Kant says, if you dare say to somebody else, you are condemned for what you're doing, you will go to hell for what you're doing, then you must be willing to also add, and if I'm wrong, then I shall go to hell. If you're not willing to add that, if you're willing to condemn somebody else, but still believe that maybe there's a slight chance you're wrong and therefore still don't want to bet on your condemnation, but rather still want to keep the possibility of begging for forgiveness, then you have no conscience if you condemn that other person. But once again, this whole bet, it requires truthfulness, and many people also, if they pretend to be religious, don't have that. There's really, as I said in the previous lecture, no limit to the human capacity to lie to yourself. I had that with a person who shocked me, who I did think was more religious than that, but in one instance she made a moral misjudgment, a very gross misjudgment, and it was clear, I mean, even if she wouldn't have been certain if it was a mis or correct judgment, it was clear that she was not in a place to judge at all. She judged about something happening which she did not witness. She judged about people which she did not know, just from hearsay. And with that alone was willing to cancel. And I asked her, are you really certain? Can you stand for this in front of God? Would you be willing to say, God, if I'm wrong in this one instance, no matter what a great person I might have been otherwise, then throw me into hell? And I mean, she could not have said yes rationally, right? You would have, and that was my point. I wanted her to wake up. I wanted her to not necessarily change her opinion immediately, but at least take back her harsh judgment and at least be willing to first look at the matter. Right? Employ Kant's skeptical method that I talked about in its own lecture. Holding back your judgment till you actually are in a place from which you can judge. But she outright said, yes, I would bet my eternal felicity on that. So she was willing to lie to herself to that degree. Because I'm absolutely certain if she really did stand in front of God, she would talk differently. So that is why all of this whole bet that Kant suggests, it does not work if you are willing to lie to yourself. And that, once more, is why to Kant, this is basically the most important commandment of morality. You must be truthful. The lie, I also addressed this in my lecture on the radical evil. The lie is the radical evil. It is the root of all evil. If we lie, this is, as Kant says, an opiate for our conscience. It shuts up our conscience. And then we can do everything and tell ourselves, yes, we are certain that it is right. We would stand for it even in front of God. So you mustn't ever lie to yourself, otherwise you cannot be a moral person. Anyways, with this, I'm at the end of talking about conscience as such, but I want to address one other thing, and that is that this whole test with the bed, it is meant for moral matters, it is meant for the practical, for our actions, but as Kant says, it also works in the theoretical. By asking yourself if you are willing to bet on something, you can check how certain you are of something, right? How certain you are that this is the truth. Like, if you told somebody 1 plus 1 is 2, or Paris is the capital of France, and he asked you, oh, are you really certain that this is right? Are you willing to bet on it? Like, would you bet €1,000? Then you would probably say, yeah, sure. I mean, sounds like a good way to to easily make €1,000. But then, let's say you believe that there are aliens out there somewhere. That we are not alone in this universe. But let's say someone asks you, are you willing to bet? And let's say somehow you had a means of finding out. Like, you could press a magic button that tells you if somewhere on some other planet in this universe there's also life. Maybe you are certain enough because you say, oh, there are so many billions of planets, it's just so unlikely that there's life only on this one. Maybe you would be willing to bet €10, maybe €100, maybe €1,000, but maybe not 1,000,000. Maybe not your life. Maybe you do believe there are aliens, but it would be crazy to bet your life or even your eternal felicity on it, when really at the end of the day it's just an opinion based on probably on likelihood, but nothing that you can confirm. So this is actually an easy way to check your own level of certainty. And unfortunately, once again, most people don't do that, and therefore most people are liars. Most people constantly, unknowingly, I'm not saying they're conscious liars, but unknowingly they constantly spread lies. I just have to think back some time ago. Acquaintances invited me to some garden party, and there were lots of other people there. And I was standing with a group of 5, 6 people. It's interesting. I remember the scene, right? Like, I remember what it looked like. I remember some of the people, what they looked like, but I'm not certain how many people there were. Was it 5, 6, maybe even 7? Even that, it's certainly not something. Honestly, I would not even bet €10 on that, because I really don't remember the number. It's certainly I would not bet my eternal felicity on how many people there were. So you should really try this thing with the bet, even just for a day. With everything, even the smallest things you believe, like your memories or things you hold to be true. And if you honestly ask yourself, how much would I be willing to bet on that? Then you will realize how little you actually know, how little you actually are certain of. But anyways, I was standing with some people, and the conversation got to me, being a Kant expert, and this one guy started saying, oh yes, Kant, he's famous for never really having left Königsberg, never having gotten around. But what most people don't know is that there's an exception. He went to St. Petersburg in his youth when he was like 18 one time. And I said, no, he didn't. But this guy said, oh, yes, he did. Like, most people don't know, it's not very well known, but one time he had this trip to St. Petersburg. Now, I am fairly certain that this is not true. And I would be willing indeed to bet some money on that. I mean, I have dealt with Kant a lot. And I have never once in my life come across this story. there's nothing in Kant's writings. I mean, to be sure, Kant doesn't like to talk about himself. His writings are impersonal. He doesn't mix personal anecdotes. But I mean, even his physical geography, where he talks about, well, geography, how the world is made up, is very clearly based just on journals of voyages from other people that he read. There's no indicator at all that he ever went anywhere. Also, I didn't just read his published books, right? I read his letters, and in his letters there's not a single sentence, not a single remark that hints at him ever having been to St. Petersburg, to Moscow, ever having known anyone from there. And I've also read several biographies on Kant by his own friends that knew him in his life, and they never mentioned that he mentioned anything about that to him. And I mean, if Kant had ever gotten to St. Petersburg, I would say that at no point in his life is this more unlikely to have occurred than when he was like 18, because at that time he was a student in Königsberg at the university, and he was not from a very wealthy family. So I don't see how he could just have taken some weeks or some months off and just gone on a trip for, yeah, what for? Just to be a tourist, just for the fun of it, or what? So I'm fairly certain about this. But would I bet my eternal felicity on it? Probably not. I mean, maybe Kant was in St. Petersburg, and maybe it really is just a not very well known fact. I would be careful with it. And that's the problem, because the other guy wasn't, right? He talked about it as if he was absolutely certain, which I'm sure he was not, even if he believed himself to be, maybe. I'm sure if he had really been asked, like if he dies and stands in front of God and God tells him, are you really sure that Kant went to St. Petersburg? I'm God. I know whether he did or not. And if you tell me that you are sure, but he didn't go there, then you go to hell. I don't think he would dare saying that. So clearly he wasn't certain. But he talked as if he was talking with certainty. And that gave me at least some pause. Because, I mean, I don't know where he got it from, right? He must have gotten it somewhere. Maybe some other person told it to him and he just believed it without checking. But maybe he does have a real source. Maybe he read some proper biography of Kant's that mentioned it. I couldn't know. And that's an issue that in such a debate, the person who is more conscientious will be more careful, will appear less certain of himself. And for the onlookers, that means that the less conscientious person, simply because he acts as if he was certain, is often more convincing. And that is why this is so irresponsible and so unconscientious of him. I mean, I don't know the people that were standing around, 5 or 6 people, but maybe because of this talk and because he acted with more certainty than I, seeming more sure of himself, maybe 1 or 2 of them went home now believing that Kant once went to St. Petersburg. And maybe they even spread that. Maybe they went on at the next garden party telling someone, oh, did you know people always say Kant never got around, but few people know that once he went to St. Petersburg. And that's how rumors spread, right? And you may think that in this case it's not so important. I mean, what does it matter if people believe a wrong biographical fact about Kant? But the thing is that this constantly happens. I mean, think of quotes, for example. How many misquotes are out there, right? There are these collections of quotes. There are also websites for quotes. And usually these sites anyone can just put any quote on there, right? Without having to give a source. Like, you go to these sites and there's some quote, and then below the quote it just says Albert Einstein or Arthur Schopenhauer or Confucius or Buddha or Mark Twain or Isaac Newton or whoever. But funnily enough, it never says where, right? It just reads Immanuel Kant, but it does not say Immanuel Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason on page 83 or so. And a lot of these quotes are misattributions. Like, these quote sites where everyone could put a quote online, they are completely worthless. Like, I would not be surprised if more than half their quotes are wrong. Again, I'm not betting my eternal felicity on that. I don't know any statistical data on how many wrong and how many correct quotes they have, but it would not surprise me. There are so many wrong quotes out there. And of course, there are some famous people that people just love attributing wrong quotes to, right? Like, if you read a quote by Einstein or by Confucius or by Mark Twain, you can be almost certain that the quote is wrong and the guy never said that. Often you can even know without checking, just from thinking a little. Like, often the quote just doesn't fit with what the person actually believed or actually talked, or often the quote doesn't fit with the time, or often it doesn't fit with the usual writing style of that person. Often it would be easy to recognize, but still people will just read a quote that they like because they think it sounds deep, and it just says that the quote is, say, by Nietzsche, and then they don't fact check it. They just take the quote and put that on their Facebook or on their Twitter and also say, quote by Nietzsche, and then the next guy spreads it. And that is how fake news, how wrong facts spread, right? And you may believe it doesn't matter in such instances, but then there are instances where this clearly has practical repercussions. Like, here in Germany in the last years, whenever somebody has been getting stabbed or a car drove into a group of people, immediately, all over social media, you would read people saying, oh, the guy who did it was heard to scream Allahu Akbar, it was a terrorist attack, even while the police says, we can't say anything yet, we don't know what happened. And that's a problem, right? Many people will just read this fake news, and when then the police some days later comes out and says, no, we confirmed the motives now and it has nothing to do with terrorism and he's not a Mohammedan and anything, he's not a refugee. Many people just heard the fake news on social media and they will never hear the real news from the police. And many people will maybe hear the real news from the police, but will now say, oh, they're just lying, they're just trying to cover it up because we are ruled by woke leftists that don't want you to see the truth. And I mean, the same thing, to come back to the genocide in Gaza, the same thing is how the genocide got justified, right? At the beginning, they spread these lies about 40 beheaded babies and all that stuff, and our media just gobbled it up and just repeated it without checking. And I mean, this is what justifies the whole genocide, right? Because if you have a real picture of what happened on October the 7th, then you will realize, I mean, not that I want to justify it or relativize it. Of course, war crimes were committed. I mean, attacking civilians is a crime, and taking hostages, it's a war crime, and of course children were killed, children were murdered. Not 40 babies, only 2 babies and some older children and teens, and the babies were not systematically beheaded, they died in the crossfire. But still, that's a crime. One murdered baby is already one murdered baby too many. But still, October the 7th is not the crime of the century. It's not the instance of terrible barbarism that it was made out to be. And if you compare to what Israel has done in Gaza, there is just no way you can say that what is done in Gaza is justified by October the 7th. And I mean, it's clear that on October the 7th, 36 kids, yeah, not babies, but underage people, were killed. Well, Israel has now killed probably 20,000 children or more. It is clear that that cannot be justified by the killing of 36 children. So the only way they can justify that or try to justify that is if they don't make it just about the numbers but about the how, right? If they say, okay, we killed more children, but when we do it, it's an accident, it's because Hamas uses human shields, and they specifically beheaded babies. This was an act of barbarism. And here too, the problem is many people heard that, and they never heard what came later. They never heard, oh no, there were no 40 beheaded babies. I mean, even Israel by now, they themselves have given out the list, right, of the people that were killed, and we know that there were only 2 babies killed. But many people never heard that. And the problem is, even if they did hear it, many people don't base their opinions on anything rational. They base it on feeling, on sensitivity. So they heard this propaganda, they were shocked by the barbarism, the alleged barbarism of the 7th of October. And even later, when it gets fact-checked and corrected, on a theoretical level, they might register that some of the details they were given were wrong, but on an emotional level, they still feel the same shock. They still feel this has now, so to say, locked into them, that October the 7th was terrible. And no amount of correcting what was said can change that. So that is why it is so dangerous to not be more conscientious about what you spread, what you claim to be true. And of course, you should never do that. You should not do it in your private life. You should not tell your friend something as if it was true, which you would not bet your eternal felicity on, so that he then goes on to spread it. But especially if you speak publicly, you should not do that. You should be conscientious enough to check what you're saying. But most of the time, I mean, you don't realize it, but a lot of what you take for granted, what you believe, is probably just prejudices and lies that have been spread again and again, and that everyone repeats and nobody ever questions. Like a lot of things you believe about the past. If you believe, for example, that in the Middle Ages they dumped their feces out of the window, and that all the streets were super dirty and muddy and everything was stinking and people didn't wash, nothing of this has any truth to it. Any serious historian will tell you that. But the thing is, we have all heard it, and we have all seen it in countless movies, and even those cheap documentaries for, I don't know, History Channel or whatever, they also repeat it, and even school history books repeat it. And everyone takes it for a fact because everyone else takes it for a fact, right? You hear everyone say it, you hear everyone present it in that way, so why would you ever question it? And that's how it works with so many things. Going back to Gaza once again, I still read, at least here in Germany, so often Hamas is using human shields. Hamas is using human shields. And still, here in Germany, if you say this is not true, you are treated like a lunatic, like a conspiracy theorist. Even the people who at this point criticize Israel for going too far will still believe that Hamas is using human shields. But if you really ask those people, would you bet your eternal felicity on it? Like, if you tell those people, okay, you can say Hamas is using human shields, but you now got 24 hours to present proof. And if you can't present a source, a reliable, independent source, not the IGF, that confirms this, then you get executed. Then maybe people would become more careful about saying that. Because actually this is just one of these things that even the journalists, they don't check, because most journalists don't bother doing actual journalism. They just repeat propaganda that they actually believe, right? It's not some big conspiracy. Nobody is making them do it. They just suck at their job. They just rather report on their own ideology and prejudices than report on the facts. I have now spent more than a year almost daily listening to conversations, to lectures about Gaza and so on, and I have yet to be presented with any proof that Hamas in any one instance used human shields. I would not bet my eternal felicity on the fact that they don't do it. Maybe they did in some instance that I'm not aware of, but certainly not in large, certainly not in such a systematic manner as it is presented to us. Of course, Israel does that because every accusation is a confession, right? We know and we have confirmed that the Israeli soldiers, that the IGF in Gaza and also in the past in the West Bank and stuff, that they constantly force Palestinians to serve as their human shields, to go into buildings and into tunnels first, in case there are fighters there or in case there are traps there. But I don't know of any confirmed cases where Hamas did that. And likewise, I read in the German media again and again, Hamas, they are a misogynist, anti-Semitic organization that just wants to create a caliphate. Like, this is actual media, right? This is not some conspiracy sites. This is the mainstream German media. This is newspapers that are highly respected. And I would be treated as a conspiracy theorist if I said those newspapers are not reliable, they lie. But of course, Hamas never said they want to create a caliphate. They want to free Palestine. Maybe their vision for how Palestine afterwards should be governed, what laws there would be, are not perfectly in line with Western values. Like, I'm not saying they would create a perfect Western democracy that is super secular, but they do not want to create a caliphate. There's no Hamas leader that proclaimed himself a caliph. And likewise, as for misogyny, I mean, I'm not saying that everything is perfect as regards women's rights in Gaza. I mean, it's not here either, if we are being honest with ourselves. But Hamas, in many cases, supported women. And they actually supported women getting an education. And the levels of education in Gaza were very high, including for women. The levels of literacy, the levels of PhDs. And there also was never any enforced veiling. Like, you don't have to wear hijab in Gaza. Many women do. But if you actually ever bothered to learn anything about it, you would know just from pictures and videos that many also don't. Like, think of someone like Bizan, who doesn't wear a hijab. And it is clear how these journalists work when they write this. They don't stop before writing Hamas wants a caliphate, Hamas is misogynist, and ask themselves, wait, how do I know that? What is actually my source? Am I certain about this? Like, would I still write it if I could go to jail or I could get executed if I couldn't prove that sentence? No, I can tell you how they work. They are like, Hamas, they are Islamists. Whatever that word means. I mean, serious people don't use that word, right? But Hamas, they're Islamists, and that means they're basically like the Taliban or like Daesh, right? And Daesh wanted to create a caliphate, and the Taliban force women to completely veil themselves, so then Hamas must be the same. That's their journalism. And then they spread that, and everyone believes it, and I am now treated like a lunatic conspiracy theorist, or like someone who wants to defend Hamas, if I correct that. And unfortunately, most people, again, have no conscientiousness at all. They talk publicly with lots of people listening to them, and they don't care about checking what they are saying. I try to do that. I mean, that is why I've read all of Kant, right? And I'm probably the only one here on YouTube. That is actually something I would be willing to bet on. Maybe not my eternal felicity once again, but I would bet some money on that. Like there are tons of other videos here explaining Kant, and maybe I'm not saying they all suck completely. I haven't watched them all. But what I am saying is that most people who talk about a philosopher, and not just here on YouTube, this includes even the professors at university, know him at best superficially. Maybe they just repeat what they have heard in some other video, in some other lecture, or what they have read on Wikipedia. Or maybe at best they have read a little of him, maybe just an excerpt of one of his works, just the introduction. Or maybe they have read 1 or 2 or 3 of his works, but not all of them. Well, that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to be absolutely certain that what I say about Kant here is correct. That I don't say something wrong and spread misinformation about Kant because maybe I misremember something, or maybe I don't have the whole picture of Kant's philosophy and therefore misunderstand something. That is why, before talking about Kant here and before writing my books about Kant, I read all 29 volumes of Kant's works. I read every single sentence that we have of Kant, every sentence that he ever wrote that has been passed down to us. Be it his lectures, his notes, his letters, and even his published works. And those I had read years before already. Like, I hadn't read all his letters and all his lectures before, but I had read all 9 volumes of his published works, his books and essays that he published himself. But even those I reread, because I didn't want to talk about them from memory. I wanted to refresh it. And this is my thoroughness, this is my conscientiousness, because I take public speaking and spreading information to people extremely seriously. And I'm not saying that I'm not making mistakes. Maybe I'm still at some point saying something which is wrong. And if so, and if somebody notices, I would love to be corrected in the comments, because I don't want to spread wrong information. And I have no problem admitting if I made a mistake somewhere, and it can be shown and proven to me that it is a mistake. But at least I try to only say things that I can bet on. And unfortunately, few people do that. I mean, the only person in public who really has expressed this level of responsibility that I'm aware of is Greta Thunberg, who said very clearly,
I have a very close relationships to a lot of climate scientists, and that I think is necessary when you have so many people listening to what you're saying, and especially when you hold speeches that is going to be seen by a lot of people. You need to have a solid ground. You cannot just make assumptions. You need to have facts on everything and sources of everything. And so when I have made a speech like this is almost finished, I send a copy to, it could be one scientist, sometimes it's 5 or 6 scientists and to just let them have a look and make sure everything is as it is supposed to be, and that nothing can be defined in a different way, and that it cannot be misunderstood. And also I ask them sometimes personal questions like, what does this mean, and why are they talking about that, and why, and so on, to have them explain things to me, and that has helped a lot.
And this is something that she should be respected for, even by her enemies, if they were capable of such a thing as respect, or if they cared about truth and integrity at all. And this is also why she should be taken seriously, right? Like, especially here in Germany, she has been attacked relentlessly as an anti-Semite, and I've read so many newspaper articles by journalists who don't know anything at all about the Middle East, that said, oh, she should not talk about things that she doesn't know anything about. And I always wondered, why do you think she does? I mean, someone who has come out and said, I take my responsibility as someone with a platform seriously, as someone who, when she talks about the climate, has her speeches checked by scholars. I mean, I'm not saying that that alone is proof that she also does the same thing when it comes to Gaza. It is possible that someone is only conscientious in one area, not in another. But that should at least make it likely that this level of responsibility and integrity and conscientiousness she also has when she talks about Palestine. That at least makes it likely that she does know what she's talking about, that she did inform herself, and that we should take what she says, even if we shouldn't immediately believe it without checking, we should at least take it much more seriously than whatever some random journalist says who basically just repeats his own prejudices over and over again. Kant says, be like the elephant. And I don't know if the elephant is actually like that, or how Kant knows. Like, this is something that I also wouldn't bet my eternal felicity on, but it's a nice image at least. Kant says, be like the elephant who, when he walks, always makes sure he has sure footing on 3 legs and only lifts a 4th leg to make the next step when the other 3 legs are secure. And this leads me to one final small point, and that is that this truthfulness and conscientiousness is especially important for the philosopher. And philosopher you can take here in the broader sense, as I explained in my lecture, what is philosophy to Kant. At the time, philosophy also included natural science, which Kant considers applied or empirical philosophy. So you could say this goes for scientists, for scholars in general. Fichte would later go on to state that with even more clarity, that finding the truth, it's not just about how smart you are, it's a matter of character, it's a matter of your heart, so to speak. Fichte would say being wrong actually makes you guilty, actually is a sin. And that being right is actually a merit, is actually a virtue. Because if you don't love truth, if you don't live by what should be the principle of the philosopher or of the scientist in general, that is fiat veritas et pereat mundus, so let there be truth even if the world perishes over it. If this is not your position, then you will at some point hit a wall. Some will hit it sooner, some later, but there will come a point where some truth is uncomfortable, where it doesn't fit with your ideology, with your self-image, with your desires. and where therefore you will have to choose whether you want to actually see that truth and admit it to yourself, even if you don't like it, or whether you will lie to yourself. But not only must you be, as a philosopher, as a scientist, honest with yourself, not only must your love for truth be greater than your self-interest, you also must be honest with others, Kant says. And that's why he says, you shall not lie, you shall not give false testimony, is the highest commandment for the philosopher. Because the progress of science and the quest for truth, the search for new cognitions, it's not a one-man show. It's a community's effort, the effort of the scientific community. Like, you need to publish your findings, to present them to other scholars who can check them, dismiss them if they are wrong, build on them and expand on them if they are right. And that's why Kant stresses very urgently that as a scholar, as a scientist, as a philosopher, you must not hide your uncertainties. You must never present something as if you were certain, as if you had found the truth, if you are still uncertain. If in your theory or in your experiments there's still some hole, there's still something you cannot explain or something you haven't proven beyond doubt, you mustn't hide that. You must be open about that, so that others can check there. Others can check if you are actually right, if they can find a proof for your claim that you didn't find yet, or if they can refute your claim. And therefore, of course, it goes for all people, but it goes especially for the philosopher, that he must never lie, that he must always be conscientious. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Leo Allmann, Thomas Doringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Yasin Özün, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner,